Welcome back to our panel discussion, the intersection of cybersecurity and intelligent automation, sponsored by KPMG here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are Leo Scanlon, Senior Advisor for Healthcare and Public Health Sector Cybersecurity in the Office of the CIO at Health and Human Services. Dr. Ray Latier is Chief of the Cybersecurity Division at the U.S. Marine Corps, and Tony Hubbard is Principal at KPMG. I'm your host, Tom Temin. And in this segment, why don't we go into a little bit of the idea of how you automate and orchestrate all of these different components. There's tools, there's data, there is information from that data about things happening, and then sometimes something happens bad, and then you've got to orchestrate a whole string of responses to that. And so, Tony, why don't we start with you on what you see across government that way, and what are some of the best practices, maybe even bringing in the commercial side too.
Sure. So automation from a cyber perspective, I think, is getting a lot of attention now, but it's not necessarily a new concept. I mean, all of us that do online banking, when we fumble finger our password and we have to, log back in and get a new account, we can do a lot of that in an automated way. So there's kind of bots operating behind the scenes to help with that. But obviously, with the reduced cost of some of these capabilities and more wide adoption of them, they're becoming more prevalent. But I think one of the, and there's numerous elements from a cyber perspective in terms of reviewing access lists, who has access to systems, and making that more automated, reviewing audit trail data. I know one of the banes of our cyber world is audit data. It's just capturing so much data, so having automated routines to review that data, identify risks, and follow up on those risks. So there's numerous benefits to automating. I think one of the concerns, though, is the perception that if we're going to automate this task or automate that task, that we've solved the problem. And I think that, unfortunately, even as recently as the WannaCry issue proved that wasn't the case. You could automate all these processes, but if somebody in your organization receives an email with a link and clicks on that link, next thing you know, you have malware in your environment and you're vulnerable. And there's, unfortunately, not too many technologies that are going to help with that. Leo alluded to earlier, dual-factor authentication, which is certainly a great move to prevent some of that. But I think that is a key theme, that just making sure that even though you're going to move to automation and have more tools and capabilities, that you're still grounded in having that foundation of sometimes not the most exciting elements of cybersecurity, but policies and procedures, training and awareness are certainly important. And having those foundational blocks in place, almost every study will show that more and more vulnerabilities, and the most common cause of all the vulnerabilities we're seeing are phishing attacks, where, as I mentioned earlier, somebody receives an email, clicks on it, and then we have an issue in the environment. So
you can't tighten down the nut behind the keyboard, basically.
I mean, as much as we would all certainly like to automate things, there's still going to be the human factor to it. And as long as you have that human factor, there's still going to be some of these other elements that just can't totally be automated.
Now, a lot of agencies ask the question, and we've heard this many times, that, okay, so your tools are automated and they assess the data and they issue an alert, and then someone does something. So the next question becomes, that person that does something, can that be automated? And therefore you just get a report on this happened. A lot of agencies are not comfortable with that idea of having the human intervention out of the picture until everything is fixed or patched or repelled or whatever the case might be. So what are you seeing there, again, generally, and what are some of the best practices on that question?
From a best practice perspective, I think, it comes down to the basics. I know we all get tired of walking around the halls and seeing security awareness training campaigns and posters and things like that, but there's numerous studies that have shown that those types of things work. I'm a big believer and want to exercise to test some of those elements is social engineering, where you will do an exercise to impersonate a help desk technician to call somebody up to try to get a password. And when we've done those studies going back 10 years, it used to be that 99.9% of the time you would get a password. And now oftentimes you're not. So I think there's evidence showing that the training and awareness and just those fundamental aspects do reap benefits, but I think you have to stay with it.
Of the enterprise response to, say, a cyber attack, where people would initiate a bunch of steps to repel that attack or mitigate for it, can that be automated upon the issuance of an alert from your tool monitoring? or I mean, that's where I think people are uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, and I think that's where we're going. I think we alluded to it earlier. In the federal government, when you start automating techniques, it's not necessarily in the commercial side. When you start automating some of these activities, you're doing it more maybe from a cost or a profit motive. You're trying to do more with less. But in the federal environment, it's more, let's take these limited resources from here, automate some of these techniques you're talking about, and then we can deploy our resources into more advanced research and analysis of an intrusion attempt, and things like that.
So yeah, Leo, you look like you're reacting to that idea.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and challenging one because we've learned, and others have, at the top of the capability chain, there are promises that artificial intelligence will be able to start to answer the kinds of questions you're asking.
Right.
The real fact is, though, that the environments are so complex that an automated response to a particular threat might not be the thing you need to do across your entire environment. So how do you distinguish that? And we've learned, even though the new tools that we've got and the automated alerting, which is a very important major step forward, does not give us the ability, the intelligence, to then decide how to act. That is being done by humans. So I mentioned our HKIC center. Its purpose is to put threat analysts together, sitting on a floor, looking at their screens from our different operating divisions, from different organizations. They can look at something and say, hey, what do you know about that? Oh, I know this. Did you see this before? Yes, we've seen. And out of that process, human discussion, comes an assessment of the threat that can then define an action. So we've kind of, it sounds like we've taken a step backwards to put the human back in the loop, but we're actually doing it at a higher level, utilizing these tools. But we've learned at the end of the day, it's threat analytics, it's humans talking to humans, it's analysts sharing with each other that is building the defenses against these high-speed attacks and the advanced persistent threat, the presence that is there and you don't know it, the other half of the thing. That's hard to automate against, very tough to detect. We've got an initiative underway. We're working with the NHISAC, is a very exciting thing, to work on the MITRE attack framework, which is a detailed analysis of how to detect advanced presence on your network, sort of a map of the genome. And there's been a voluntary alliance of major corporations, HHS, FFRDCs like MITRE, participating to develop tools that would take those frameworks and then develop usable queries that humans can run against their network. So this is research work that the sector is working on again, on a voluntary basis to make this stuff available, because this is where the future is of using this data. We've got the data. We have almost too much of the data at this point. Now we need to be able to analyze it and get at it and then turn it into actionable intelligence.
You know, we're doing the same thing in the DoD as we looked at that same kill chain construct. And it's been a focus between various agencies in the DoD is how can we take a look at that entire attack chain, the impacts that go across that, the steps, if you will, to a successful movement across that. We're categorizing those as to what particular choke point can we get to right away, because we've looked at this, the kill chain construct, and we said we can't do everything. We can't hit every single aspect on every single level. It's just going to be too expensive. But a lot of our aspects of this are, what I talk about Comply to Connect, is a compliance response. Now, many of us said earlier, we were talking about it, we're thinking just compliance first. And when people get caught in a checklist aspect of compliancy, they don't get into the actual analysis of what they're compliant with, what the compliancy gives them. But we still have to start someplace with the baseline. So we state in the Marine Corps is that we are going to be compliant. That's what NACR will push us to be, is to compliant at that point and keep us compliant. So if something unusual comes in, like the WannaCry aspect, it will be something that should have been patched in March. Well, then it's going to get pushed and patched. It's going to get remediated. It's going to the virtual system may be taken down and a new one put up right away. So it is almost like whack-a-mole in some cases, but we're trying to speed that part up. We do have to be careful of removing the humans out of the environment, because the humans, though the problem, and I keep telling them, don't click the link. But when the OPM issue happened, and then we started getting push-outs from the DoD that's saying, oh, look, we've got something for you, the individuals that sent it, the contractor that sent it, did not digitally sign it. I had hundreds of my users going, I'm not accepting that, and they're calling and reporting. So the training, the exposure to this actually worked. It forced the DoD to change the things to get signatures on it. So there's benefits of what we're trying to do. I don't think we're ever going to get to total automation. I think
So
you always have the people to do it.
The idea of automation, but not really total autonomy.
Total autonomy, exactly. You have to have somebody there that's going to drive where it's supposed to go and do the analysis and say, is that important for us to do or not? I don't want to turn off this particular system because there's an operation going on right now.
And I think one of the other key themes around that too is, while all this automation is great, having bots that are doing all these wonderful things, is the security around the bot itself, rather than just releasing things and having the bot process go through the standard development life cycle that we would with any other application or software. I mean, Twitter unfortunately found this out last year with the Tay bot that basically went viral and it was hacked and all kinds of bad things happened from that perspective. So I think that's important. We just can't be releasing these bots without some type of rigor and governance that we've talked about earlier.
And we should also explore a little bit further. We talked about how Internet of Things complicates the whole picture. And we didn't quite fully delve into, and let's do that now in the few minutes we have left, for how cloud and substantiations of virtual machines all over the place, including maybe the tools we use to monitor, how that complicates the whole idea of what it is we're monitoring and how we automate it when it's not our own hardware, software.
In some cases also, do we have insight into what the tools are being used by the provider? Will those providers share those with us on a continuous basis to our network organizations like McCog and the Marine Corps and such? We still have to work through that on the commercial approach, which why we in the Marine Corps we're still doing private cloud right now. We have to work this out within ourselves. And we're discovering also too of where is the boundaries? What type of security review tools do I have? Is it at a virtual level? Is it in the rack, which is hosting the virtual systems? Where is that got to go, and what type of information can I get from that? As I said, we're also automating, looking to automate our applications, an application development and test environment. Constant reiteration or review before it even gets pushed out. Trying to push that, if you will, the security building of the applications to the left. But that means now as I push something out into the wild, into the environment, even to commercial location, if I find something wrong with the application, I have to quickly rebuild it. How can I be sure I'm going to get that other version updated and replaced?
Sure.
When I have control myself, I kind of have the ability, but when I don't know that into the other cloud providers, there's an aspect of the unknown that does kind of bother us a little bit.
And Leo, you're probably more into the commercial cloud mix with your own data centers.
Right. We have a fairly aggressive move into the cloud across HHS. But more interesting is the fact that we are in the forefront of authorizing the FedRAMP environments that are used. And the authorization process of FedRAMP is to allow one agency or entity to authorize an environment, and then that authorization can be leveraged by others to save people the cost of going through all of this work. But at the same time, it's posing an interesting challenge. On-premises systems we have a great deal of control over. We have a lot of monitoring. We also control the identities. We have a strong authentication system, as I've mentioned, two-factor, which is bound to an assured identity that we check very carefully for all access to government systems. When you start putting your data in the cloud, you don't have that assurance over the provider. The provider is a commercial provider, and the cost of that provider doing what we are doing inside the government could very easily wipe out the savings that we're getting from the technological advantages of the cloud. So we're in a delicate balancing act now of how do we manage this trust relationship that exists as we move into the cloud computing environment. So HHS has been very actively involved in this, and we're talking to a lot of people about what we think those problems are and where we should go.
Okay, and Tony, last question to you. We have about 60 seconds, and that is how do you bake all of this into the service level agreements?
Yes, service level agreements are essential, and I think what all of us have probably had experiences where we've gone in and seen a compromise or a vulnerability. We'll ask for your service level agreements, and you kind of get wide-eyed look, well, what's that? And that's certainly a challenge, and that's where really it all starts, is having that service level agreement in place with the provider, making sure that you don't just accept their standard contracts and agreements, that you actually can negotiate that to make sure that your protections are in place for your environment, specific to your environment. And that's essential.
And just pulling on that SLA thread, I mean, recently the GAO issued one of its many reports that few agencies are really getting all of the service level agreement provisions they need to into cloud contracts. And so that's probably true where it comes to cybersecurity in the cloud and the automation and the whole attestation deal going on there. Can you tell us about what are some good ways to make sure your SLAs are working for you as a federal agency?
Yeah, certainly, the SLAs, as I mentioned, is a critical part of the process. But making sure that, well, two things: making sure that you don't just agree to the SLA that the vendor provides you. You need to have some negotiation in there, because again, ultimately when your data is going into the cloud or into that provider's environment, it's still your data. So you have to have ownership of that data and have control over that data. So you're certainly, you need to be vested in making sure you're getting your particular requirements into the contracts and the service level agreement. But the second part of that's important is having some type of attestation around the controls and processes that third party is operating on your behalf. So making sure that the third party itself has appropriate security controls and contingency plans and things like that.
All right, some great insight today. That brings our program to a close. I want to thank today's guests. They are Leo Scanlon, Senior Advisor for Healthcare and Public Health Sector Cybersecurity in the CIO Office of Health and Human Services. Dr. Ray Latier is the Chief of the Cybersecurity Division at the United States Marine Corps. And Tony Hubbard, Principal at KPMG. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term KPMG.
On behalf of KPMG, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with the download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.